You've probably heard of the wealth gap when talking about economics, especially in the context of the United States. That is when there's a discrepancy between the bottom wealth owners and the top wealth owners. That is, the rich own too much and the poor own too little. But there is a wealth gap in Bitcoin that you might not have known about. This video will explain and explore that wealth gap and what it means for Bitcoin and for you. So, just what is the Bitcoin wealth gap? Well, let's start off with the top 10 Bitcoin addresses. This here is a list of those 10 addresses currently, and you can see that they have over 1 million Bitcoin shared between just those 10. That's worth 457 billion USD. That's quite a lot for 10 addresses. But that's just the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. What about the rest? Well, looking at this chart, we can see that 90% of Bitcoin is owned by the top 2.5%. That is wallets that own 1 Bitcoin or more. The majority of wallets, however, are situated much lower, owning much smaller amounts of Bitcoin. Now, before I get into the reasons why and what that means, I do want to provide a caveat. These are wallets, not people. Many people do in fact split their Bitcoin earnings between multiple wallets, and so one person could actually own several wallets with under 1 Bitcoin each, but in reality own many times 1 Bitcoin. Therefore, it's not entirely fair to compare to fiat wealth inequality, where it is easier to show wealth by an individual. With that out of the way, why is there a wealth gap? Well, first off, as I said, these aren't people, and plenty of addresses are in fact owned by companies. Exchanges, for example, operate single addresses to process transactions day to day, and since they are dealing with the Bitcoin of thousands of people, naturally they'd control a lot of that Bitcoin. Additionally, because Bitcoin is a relatively new concept, the total opt-in rate is actually quite low. People who bought Bitcoin early on have found themselves as millionaires, as early adopters rode the wave. Both of these things lead to a select few holding a large amount of Bitcoin. That isn't to say, though, that there aren't wealthy owners. It is suspected that many of the top addresses are owned as investments by already wealthy individuals who are trying to diversify and improve their portfolio. So what does this mean? Well, it might not be as much of a cause for concern as general wealth inequality. Bitcoin still offers plenty of features that help the poor and unbanked. Even if they don't own a lot of Bitcoin, they can still reap the benefits. Plus, owning a lot of Bitcoin doesn't actually get you that much with regard to the politics of Bitcoin. To influence Bitcoin, you still need a majority of nodes and miners, and just having a bunch of Bitcoin doesn't automatically give you that. So the democratization is still preserved. Miners and node owners have their say despite wealthy Bitcoin owners. And I know that I said earlier that it's not easy to compare Bitcoin with fiat wealth, but how does this wealth gap compare with the US wealth gap? Well, as you can see here on Bitcoinist, it is actually a higher gap within Bitcoin than in the US. The top 10% own 90% of Bitcoin, while the top 10% only own 77% of the US wealth. And of course, Bitcoin has many advantages compared to fiat, where you have less chances of outside actors controlling it, like banks and governments. To sum up, Bitcoin does have a huge wealth gap, but it might not be as much of an issue as the fiat wealth gap, and it is also likely spurred on by the same reasons. But it is still true, 2.5% own 90% of Bitcoin, and that's a little troubling.